Hi everyone, good morning. A pleasure to be here. My first time at GFT. I've been learning a lot. I'm faculty at the University of Arizona, and full disclaimer, I don't do not modeling or anything like that. I have a background in architecture and urban design. I study urban planning and urban resilience. So hopefully what I present today brings a different perspective that can enrich the conversations. Thank you. So the title of my presentation is Green Infrastructure to Mitigate Urban Flooding. And I'm concentrating in Tucson, Arizona, where we live. So the world is becoming urbanized. The trend is going to continue. Cities are very vulnerable to climate change, including flooding, but also heat, drought, and other stressors. The main point I want to make in my presentation is that the way we design future neighborhoods and ultimately cities will impact future flooding. So I'm making the case for green infrastructure, and what is usually known with many names: nature-based solutions, low-impact development, SOTs in Europe, and many other terms. So it's basically this diagram using vegetated spaces in cities to direct runoff for infiltration and to get some vegetation growing that can protect us from heat and other stressors. There's a lot of ecosystem services that green infrastructure is known to provide. I'm listing here a few, and flood control is one important one. But for cities in arid lands, I also want to stress that the replenishment of aquifers, it's very important because that's where we get our water supply. For example, in Tucson, groundwater is the main water source. So replenishing the aquifers is not a bad idea. And also heat mitigation. Heat, I don't know if you've been to Arizona, but it's a big thing. And with less heat, it's really, really significant. Green infrastructure, the concept, has been around for a long time. I'm showing you here the father of landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted. It's the landscape designer who designed Central Park and other iconic sites. And he designed neighborhoods. He designed this community in Riverside, Illinois. And as you can see, the river, the creek, is completely left in its natural state. It kind of seems like common sense, but that's the least common of the senses, at least in urban planning and urban design. So it was in the 1800s. There's another example by the same landscape architect in Boston. It's iconic. It's the Emerald Necklet. It's called because it's an interconnected network of parks that also contains the creek left in its natural state, and also with bike paths and walking paths, and it serves also as safe infrastructure for recreational activities. It's emblematic, it's iconic, and it's really, really good. In the 70s, Ian McCart, another famous architect, came up with a similar concept. He called him ecological planning, but he basically identified sensitive areas, including creeks, wetlands, and so forth, and stayed away, left them in their natural state, so the ecosystem functioned as it used to be before development, and just restricted development to some areas where it's not sensitive. Again, makes a lot of sense, but it's not hardly ever done. He designed the woodlands in Houston, Texas. It's a famous neighborhood that didn't flood during Harvey or ever. It has never flooded. It's famous, so people who live there, they don't need flood insurance. They know they will not flood. After Ian McCart in the 70s, there were new development for the woodlands, but not quite following the same concept. They did stay away kind of the floodplain on the left. I'm showing you a map of the floodplain and the areas that were developed. They barely made it, and they just elevated the ground by a few feet of ground, of soil. And then people thought that they would be as effective as the previous woodland. They didn't buy insurance. And the figure on the right shows the flooding that occurred then, and they didn't have insurance, so it was a tragic thing. We have an example in Tucson, the Copper Creek in Oro Valley. On the left, it's the concept plan that followed Ian McCart's, just concept of leaving the creeks untouched. And on the right hand, I'm showing you the traditional way we do development, which is basically, yes, you stay away from the creeks, but you channel them, you line them with concrete, and then you discharge runoff as fast as possible. But that has a big pervasive incentive because it does allow the developer to have more loss and get more profit because, the channel gets reduced to just a canal. And for example, I'm putting you at a table here to compare the number of lots on both types of development. On the left, you have 559 lots, and on the right, 728 lots. So a lot more units that could be sold with the channelized way of disposing runoff. This is what ultimately got built in Tucson. You can see before and after. They did respect the bigger creek, which is by law, and they left the other tributary untouched, and you can see how it's visibly greener. So that's our iconic example in Tucson. So a group of colleagues and I who study urban resilience and green infrastructure came up with this new definition of green infrastructure because it's not only about green space. It's actually a combination of artificial and natural infrastructure, blue, green, and gray infrastructure. You need gray infrastructure for it to function because the streets have to have the correct slope. There you have to have the curb cuts and the downspouts so to make these things happen. Some publications that came out from these studies are here. Happy to share if you're interested. And I'm going to focus on this study that we did on the challenges of mainstreaming green infrastructure. If it's such a great idea, how come we're not doing it? What's wrong? What's happening? So we identified 5 challenges, major challenges that cities around the world face. I'm focusing in Tucson, but it's about design standards, financeability, regulatory, innovation, and socioeconomic. I'm highlighting socioeconomic here or underlining because it hasn't been addressed in Tucson. So for design standards, we are the leaders. We have manuals, everything. It's been practiced since the early 2000s at the University of Arizona. You have some examples here of before and after and how different it looks after just digging some basins and directing runoff to these areas, mitigating heat and all that. So design standards, check mark. Financiability, we figure out ways to fund green infrastructure. Here is a list of some of the programs that let homeowners and get funding to do this type of activities. I will highlight or talk about rainwater harvesting rebate program, the third one on the list, because I will talk more about it with the socioeconomic. But it's a program that is funded through the water bill. Every customer of the utility pays $1 in the water bill, and those monies get collected to fund this program. And it's a rebate, so they get a reimbursement of $2,000 if they adopt this active system of a cistern that will later use rainwater for landscape irrigation. It's funded by Tucson Water, the water utility, because they believe that, by using rainwater, users will reduce their demand for potable water. Because landscape irrigation, I'm showing you a graph here, it's the biggest use in residential households in Tucson. It didn't work like that. Actually, users got excited with the planting and they added more plants. So the water usage is really not there. But anyway, that's what is going on. Regulatory challenge. We have a lot of regulations now in place to make sure green infrastructure is in place, native plants, you name it. Lots of codes, ordinances, etc. And Tucson is a leader in green infrastructure in the United States. It's considered an emerald city, like green, by the Natural Resource Defense Council because they promote green infrastructure, highlighting it's on 13 on the list. And it's the only one located in arid regions. The rest of the cities are dealing with combined sewer overflow and lots of problems with water quality that mandates the city to comply. But Tucson, we don't have combined sewer. There's no drainage system. It hardly ever rains. So, but it's about rainwater harvesting and all that. The way it happened, it was a bottom-up approach, like local leaders that knew about these concepts started cutting curb cuts illegally and growing things with stormwater runoff. And it eventually became legal. The city adopted it, but it's an action bottom-up by local leaders and NGOs. The innovation challenge, I think, has happened because they created a community of practice. And it really broke silos. Government agencies are working together, transportation, flood control, city of Tucson, water utilities, many agencies, FEMA Association of Governments, and many other organizations meet together once a month to share lessons learned and devise ways to move forward. I'm gonna focus on flood control since this is a flood meeting. So flood control, the agency that manages flooding in Tucson, fully embrace green infrastructure. Mainly based by these data that most of the rain events in Tucson are 1-inch events. So not a lot of rain, but since I told you we don't have drainage system, it floods. So green infrastructure can deal with 1-inch rain event. So they say, there you go, that's how we are gonna do it. So they are heavily embracing green infrastructure. So remember I told you about regulations they developed in the 80s where you had to stay away from the rivers, but neighborhoods before the 80s didn't. So older parts of the city, they flood where the river used to run. Now it's where everything, you can see the path of the river and there's lots of houses that regularly flood. So they are doing this street analysis of where runoff flows and then trying to acquire lots, vacant lots that appear in those floodplains and do green infrastructure projects. For example, this is an example that Seneca Park in that area. The owner of the lot didn't pay their taxes, so the state acquired that lot and devoted for a park. But it's a park that functions really as a rainwater or a runoff basin, detention basin. But they added some park amenities that the community also enjoys. Now, the socioeconomic challenge that I told you hasn't been addressed. Here is a map from Pima County, Pima Association of Governments of tree canopy cover of greenness. And I'm highlighting here in a circle the south side of Tucson, and you can see it's visibly less green. And the south side of Tucson is home of mostly Hispanic families, low income, younger households, larger households. So it's less green. And this is a map of heat, of surface temperature. And you can see the same area is it's more hot, it's hotter than the rest of the city. And even for a few degrees, believe me, it makes a huge difference in Tucson, in your energy bill and your livability. And it also floods more. This is a picture from the south side of Tucson. Now, remember the rainwater harvesting rebate program that everyone funds through their water bill? This is a map of the people who have taken advantage of this program. As you can see in the south side, only a handful of people have applied. So it's an equity issue because everyone contributes equally, but only the wealthy are benefiting. Probably they didn't even need the rebates in the first place. The problem with the policy is that it's geared towards property owners, homeowners, and most people in the area rent their homes, so they're not eligible. Another limiting factor for them adopting that is that, you know, the rebate concept. You have to have $2,000 upfront and then wait for a reimbursement. And low-income families that live paycheck to paycheck cannot afford that. The city of Tucson are doing cognizant of this issue and are doing genuine efforts to address that. They are now giving loans or even grants to low-income families to have them adopt or take advantage of this rebate program. But I study community engagement, but just to give you a snippet, a few slides on what I do and why engagement is important in greening efforts. I'm showing you 2 traffic circles in the city. On the left, they engaged with the community. You can see artwork, established plans, a healthy traffic circle. On the right, people were not engaged. They were not supposed to, they didn't know they were supposed to irrigate the plants or take care of them, and they get eventually paid over. This is what lack of engagement looks like in greening efforts. So we do engagement at 2 levels with organizations, getting you know, efforts together, and also on the ground. We work with schools in the south side of Tucson, involving our students. We also work with faith organizations, neighborhood organizations, and so forth. How to move forward, how to scale up efforts to address equity. I'm here listing some of the lessons learned. But what I really want to make emphasis, okay, some publications that came up from these efforts of justice and green space. But I want to just spend a moment in this last slide to say, what is it to you that do flooding? What does it relate? Well, basically, in addition to climate factors, I think flooding modeling must include the way we develop our cities, our urban development, and how land use is changing or land cover is being replaced and in what way. So it must consider development scenarios. Well, it must, it could consider development scenarios, whether we do the channeling with line canal as it's mandated, and but sacrifice the profit if we do the greening option that we know functions better. Maybe a cost-benefit analysis is a good idea to really factor in the externalities of flooding, so developers can actually understand that the more profit is really costing someone else downstream a lot of trouble. And also, I think we have to engage in the models, urban planners and developers, because they seem to be key actors in the way we develop the future of cities or retrofit existing cities. And yeah, I think that's all from me today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Adriana, for the presentation. It's green infrastructure. I think it's definitely something that is also here in Europe quite prominent. We call it nature-based solutions, I guess. But and we saw even yesterday, I think the Leeds flood alleviation scheme, right? They had the plan to plant a lot of trees. So I mean, a combination like you showed is very rare. I think it's very interesting. It's also the fact that the equality that's between poor and richer communities. That's very interesting aspects. We have questions. We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Thanks for the talk, Adriana. I love that. So the equity issues, you covered that really nicely. And that cost-benefit analysis to me seems to be a key ingredient in kind of accelerate people on that getting the right. Yeah, there's the iron waste, using the engagement of flood and the reduction in costs that happen, in the areas that people cost. The least likelihood of being able to support flood insurance and all the other good things that are around like casting the quality of life to the general. Have you got any good examples in Arizona or in the US where folks are doing that sort of simple modeling to give planners better insight as to why they should encourage that in their their jurisdictions, their cities or whatever?
Yeah, we just hired a postdoc at the Europe Center for Source and Public Policy, where I also work, and she's doing cost-benefit analysis for nature-based solutions at the watershed scale. So more of the field you guys are working on. And the publication shows definitely it makes more sense. The problem I see is the silos that people work on in the government, that whoever approves the developer is not talking to the one dealing with the flooding, so that benefit is not really communicating. That's why I stress the importance of bringing urban planning into realizing like, hey, it's gonna cost more this way, but right now, if that doesn't happen, that really is not happening. Thank you.
Thanks.
So we need to
So one of the challenges we have when we try to simulate floods in urban areas is the stormwater infrastructure. And your talk got me thinking of, actually, this makes it harder because we don't, this is another layer of complexity in a way that maybe you can comment on whether there's data available. Have you seen data available where cities that adopt this kind of infrastructure, can you access where they are, what, how efficient they are, and so on, so we can maybe use them in our models to better simulate the flooding?
Yeah, a colleague of mine, Professor Bo Yang, in landscape architecture, did a study on the woodlands in Houston that I mentioned, and definitely showing that they didn't flood, didn't experience flooding, and I don't know how the data is exactly useful for modeling. I don't think a lot of modeling, I don't know, none of the modeling, but there is proof. There are studies that are showing big benefits for adopting those principles. But again, the problem is the profit, loss of profit. It's not an incentive to do this type of development. Thank you.
Okay.